Welcome, Bill Bruford, to We Will Rock You.
Thank you, Sterling.
Thank you very much for being here today. I wanted to congratulate you on a really great piece of work with your autobiography. I've read it twice through already. I really enjoyed it. One of the things I feel really sets your autobiography apart from most entertainment or music bios is the fact that you wrote it yourself with no ghostwriter. Did you have any background in writing prose prior to that?
No, not at all. And of course, I mean, it's incredibly naive of me, really, but, you know, I mean, I just kind of assumed that if you put the word autobiography at the top, it meant you'd written it. It meant that you wrote it yourself. And of course, you know, later on, somebody said, how amazing, you wrote this yourself. And it never seemed to me to be an issue. I thought everybody did.
How funny.
Shows what I know about the genre, which is namely nothing at all.
What was your process for writing this? Did you sit down and make an outline? Did you go back to journals? How did it begin?
Yeah, a little bit of the latter. I write a lot. I write on the back of, you know, those vomit bags in airplanes when I'm bored. I keep a diary sometimes if I have a laptop with me. I think about things a bit, quite a bit, I guess, in my head. And after a while, you know, a diary and comments kind of grow when you think, well, that's something I wouldn't mind kind of publishing. And before you know it, you've got half a book. I'd also been teaching a course in critical studies, what they call a cultural studies course, at university level. And I thought, there's some good material here about rock and popular music and my place in it. And I feel that I was kind of able to be reasonably dispassionate about the world that I've worked in, even though I have worked in it.
Right. And did you do a lot of rewriting? Is this more or less a first draft, or did you go back? Did you do a first draft and go back and paint?
Oh,
rewrite?
Sure. You know, and trying to find a form for it is difficult. It's not strictly speaking chronological. So, you know, I wrote a bit and I ran around and wrote a bit more and in and out of my room, kind of writing and bitting it together a little bit. And then I had a very good editor at Jawbone, which is this publisher, and he was great, but a real taskmaster. Chapter 1 came back with red ink all through it. And I thought, this is ridiculous. You can't make me do this, you know. But they do. It was a very rigorous process.
Well, that's how you get the best product in the end, of course, yeah.
It was. We spent, you know, a typical chapter would take 2 or 3 hours down the phone just arguing, you know, content, semantics, form. You know, we spent a lot of time on it. Very
good. As you mentioned, rather than a direct chronology of your career, you chose to jump backward and forward in time within each chapter in a somewhat of a stream of consciousness approach. How did you arrive at that, which is a pretty unorthodox approach?
Well, I don't know really. A straight narrative didn't seem right to me. I mean, it's a book about me certainly, but it's much more important. It's about the music industry.
Right.
So the anecdotal side of my personal experience is used only to illustrate really a bigger point. That's what I was getting at. I was making points about the music industry as I went along and using incidents from my own career really to illustrate those things I felt quite strongly about. It might be about equipment, or it might be about record companies or business or songwriting or something. But I would tend to start a chapter with an anecdote and made sure that a bigger point grew out of that. So the thing moves a little bit in waves, a bit like that.
Right. Now each chapter is titled after a frequently asked question, which is actually a very interesting, fresh approach. How did you decide to do that?
Well, you know, people like me are asked an awful lot of questions. I mean, I really don't know why. I have no idea why people don't ask their electrician all these questions. You know, musicians do a job of work, same as plumbers do. But for some reason, we have to sell our work in newspapers and so forth. And you know, there's a lot of stuff in the book about newspapers and interviews and so forth.
Right.
And a lot of time, you do get asked these extremely facile questions like, so how did you get started?
Right, right.
I always hate that one because it means that what the questioner wants is for you to recount a 41-year career to him.
Right.
So how did you get started? It always sends a chill down my spine. How do you get that fantastic sound is always a... Now, I'm not belittling the questioner here. These questions actually force the interviewee, me, to think, actually, quite a bit. Do you just play anything you like? Well, yes and no. And in interviews, you tend to just give an equally facile kind of answer. But in a book, you can expand. You can really work on that. Do you just play anything you like? Is it different being in jazz? What do you do in the daytime? I mean, Sterling, you there?
Yes, that's an extremely loaded question. What do you do in the daytime? What
do you do in the daytime is a priceless question because it's what the average guy in the street needs to know,
Right.
Because they think musicians just kind of appear, on the other side of the world and start playing. They have no idea that you have to get there.
The average person seems to have their opinion comes from the song "Money for Nothing," right?
It does. I think there's a lot of that, and I find this endearing and charming about the customer. There was once a kind of blonde bombshell stewardess on an airplane, and she, like they all do, said, "Oh, so you fellas, you guys are in a band, right? Okay, great." And she obviously was struggling for the follow-up question, and the follow-up question eventually came out rather hesitatingly: "Is do you guys play mostly long pause, mostly fast music, or kind of slow music?" and it's very hard to explain that music can often be running very fast and very slow at the same time.
Right.
And so when that came as the response, we play both at the same time. She was flummoxed.
This is a person who clearly doesn't know a whole lot about the construction.
Well, that's true, but I don't mean to demean these questions. I think they're quite fun, and they have a kind of deeper Zen side to them, which I really like.
What's the silliest question you've ever been asked by a professional interviewer?
A professional interviewer?
Yeah.
So how did you get started?
Yeah.
is perhaps the most frightening.
Yeah.
Perhaps why did you leave Yes is probably the most common.
Oh, right, right.
Not why did you form Yes, but why did you leave Yes, which of course is always interesting.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book that probably the most famous you've ever been as far as a lot of focus being on your individual name was for leaving rather than forming a band.
Yeah, that's, I think, a truism, yes.
That's good. Why are people so fascinated with that?
Good question. It's again a complete misunderstanding of what it is that musicians do, and the implication is that I turn my back on a fortune.
Right.
Anybody and fame, neither of which I'm particularly, I don't run my life around fame and fortune. And anybody who knows anything at all about the music industry would understand that if you play on a record, you get remunerated by royalties for that record, and whether you leave a group or not is immaterial.
Right, right.
So it's another one of these kind of very baby-type questions, which, again, most people will ask, and only goes to point to me the fact that I'm sure you know, that people seem to know absolutely nothing about what it is a musician does.
Do you agree that seems to make him pretty unhappy?
Well, I don't know. What is happiness? Some of us see life as being a case of honourable labour. That you're going to have to battle. You're going to have to work hard. It won't always be done with a pretty face, and often you wish that you had a quiet life. Picking apples and making cider.
Right.
But for some reason, we end up in the world that we do. I'm sure your world as a writer and journalist has its downsides.
Oh, sure.
It's just that in music you tend to be stared at by 1,000 people, and you have a light on you, and often what the light sees may not be a particularly happy camper. I defend Robert's right to look the way he likes. Just what we want here is the music.
Right. Right.
If the music has something in it, I don't care whether the guy, has horns on his head or is looking the wrong way on stage, or like Miles Davis is standing with his back to the audience. I don't care, You can wear a funny suit and be like Kiss if you want, but so long as the music's happening, I don't care what you do.
Right. Now, getting back to John for a moment, how is John Anderson different in person to work with than people might project him to be? Because he's got sort of like a cosmic sort of veil around him or whatever that people perceive because of his lyricism.
Well, don't forget it's been a long time since I knew John. I really can't speak for him now, but my recollection is that yes, there was a very soft and charming, as you say, kind of halo veiled side around him, which most people saw on stage and appeared on stage, but he could also have a fist of steel and a velvet glove,
Right.
Which
the hippie with the iron hand, is that?
I think that's a very fair kind of description. Yeah, he was very energetic in his tenacious belief in the group to start with, and I think I cite in the book that I can remember him now sitting on the staircase in this apartment we lived in, screaming at promoters and bullying them into giving us a gig.
Right.
And without somebody like that, somebody who really believes in a project, and John always believed in Yes, and it's a wonderful thing to do that and to be around someone who's like that. Without somebody like that, you ain't going to get nowhere,
Right.
So you need your John Anderson, you need your Robert Fripp. These guys are often unbelievably tenacious in pursuit of an idea and getting that idea out into the world by hell or high water. And it can be ugly, as I say. Sometimes the fist comes down and sometimes people get hurt. Isn't there an expression about cracking eggs to make an omelet?
Right. You can't make an omelet without cracking a few eggs.
Yeah, it's something like that.
Right. Now, you mentioned several times in the book how loose the accounting methods were in the early days, how muddled the contracts, how one person could end up double and triple dipping from the till. At what point did you get wise to that? At what point did that begin to change?
Again, it's you wouldn't believe really how naive and childish we all were to start with. That somehow if anybody gave you $30 a week or $50 a week, you thought you were in heaven, and that's it. You didn't ask any further questions.
Right.
Until maybe 10, 15 years later, and well, actually, I remember there were money troubles in Yes.
There still are, yeah.
Oh, there still are, probably. There always have been, I think. And until the industry came under professional regulation with real accountants and real lawyers, and some of whom acted for the musician, even, it was really a free-for-all. Again, the guy who banged his fist on the table and said, "Give me some money," probably got it.
Right.
But as I also mentioned, it was an industry that tended to be growing. This was a growth industry through the 70s, certainly. I think there was a dip in the 1973. I remember an oil crisis, one of the early oil crises in 1973, and the cost of vinyl shot up. And suddenly the record industry wasn't the bed of roses it had been. But nevertheless, it was a growth industry for many years. And so, if you don't make much money this year, well, you'd make more money next year.
Right, and you just assumed that the money would always keep...
Yeah, a little bit. But we were you wouldn't have believed the kind of naivete. We were told that you went on tour to sell records. The only reason you went on tour was to promote a record, which, generally speaking, was indeed the case. But, there were concerts and there were fees, but we kind of didn't know anything about that, And nobody really, gave us any tour accounts till about 15, 20 years into my career, certainly.
Yeah. And I don't know if it was this way back then, but there's an absolute fortune to be made in touring at a high level like that.
Now there is. There wasn't so much in those days. We didn't know about merchandising.
Right.
So, you played the concert, and if you weren't too expensive a group, you made some money. But on the whole, the bands I was in, like Yes and King Crimson, were pretty expensive to run. We had our own sound systems and light shows and stuff, and it was expensive.
Right. Now, you wrote in your book that you could make more money by suspending all new recording projects and simply focusing on collecting outstanding royalties that are still owing. That's a staggering thing.
I would think that's true. There is quite a healthy industry in royalty collection, and what's that word I'm looking for? Auditing.
Oh, right.
There's always an accountant who will audit another accountant, a lawyer who will sue another lawyer, and you can go around that game forever if you want, and you can make a reasonably handsome living finding, that payment from Argentina that never came through.
Right.
But it's kind of dull existence. I'd rather make some new music.
Right, I got you. You came up in an age and time, a rather brief window opened where a band could actually get a major record label to fund a record like Close to the Edge or Red or, a pretty unusual record, and it could find a real audience. Did you realize at the time how good you had it?
No, I don't think so. I don't think we realized that at all. I think we thought that was how life was. Now, looking back, of course, I realized that I came up through a golden era when, the kind of crew had mutinied and taken over the ship, and the usual guys, the captain, and the singer and the songwriter and the record producer, who were the main people, the main players, they kind of suddenly have vacated the bridge, and we guys, the musicians, kind of, ran riot. And yeah, you're right. We sold records on this stuff, and there was FM radio in place at the time, and FM radio would run 10-minute tracks called "Stairway to Heaven" or something. Mm-hmm. And life was great. We thought it was like that. Now, of course, I realize as I see how difficult the music industry is again today, that we had it great, and it is difficult for me as a teacher, as I sometimes am, to get up in front of a class of anywhere from 30 to 80 young musicians of one sort or another who think they're going to make a life on a stage and be the drummer in U2.
Right.
And say, look, it's difficult. I don't want to discourage people.
Sure.
Because music's a wonderful thing, but you have to realize the truth. And the truth is, it's very difficult to make a living, and only if a handful of really good people make a good living on their instrument in each country.
Right. That's true. And isn't it really not to be negative, but making a living at music isn't so much to do with your talent as with just sheer tenacity.
You need both. You need a lot of talent, I think, and the top guys are the top guys for very good reason. Because they're great. They play absolutely beautifully.
Right.
The top record producers produce great records. The top singers are great because they're great singers. So you need the talent, but you need a huge amount of patience and stamina to get there. And you could use a couple of lucky breaks as well, even if you got all that in place. So you see that it can be tricky.
Right. It's a big struggle, even when you are successful.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I never stopped working every day of my life. In fact, probably before you called, I was calling some guy in some place, anywhere from Poland to, saying, hello, my name's Bill Bruford. The reason you need to hire me is because X, Y, and Z.
Right.
Sales never stops.
There's really a fundamental misperception that it's all, it's the old sex and drugs and rock and roll perception.
Yeah, I guess so, and that is heightened by most guys who in interviews, most of the musicians in interviews who overhype that one and overact that one, and I think my book comes as counterbalance to say, hold on guys, let's be reasonable here. Let's get back to fundamentals. There are normal human beings like me, who have a normally, I'm happy to say, a great life in the music industry, which occasionally brushes up close to fame and fortune, but mostly doesn't. And this is what it's all about, So the book is a counterweight, I think, to a whole lot of bullshit.
Right. Your book really is, it's a working man's perspective of being a working musician, even though you've been a quote-unquote star in certain situations.
It's a working man's guide. I agree. I think it should be a textbook at all those kind of fame schools, that are growing, full of guitar players and drummers and so forth, who think it may be because they read in a magazine somewhere about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, And really, they need to read this.
Right, right. You know, in America, I don't know if this is the same in England, but in America we have a lot of reality, quote-unquote, reality TV shows about musicians like Ozzy Osbourne or whatever, Bret Michaels, that are really, really staged, you know, fictionalized, very vapid television shows about what it's supposed to be like to be a musician, or a star in their case. What would a show about Bill Bruford be like, a reality TV show?
Well, there would be absolutely no one. They wouldn't make a show because it seems as though nothing ever happened. I mean, until recently, because I retired, so I don't do it anymore, but until recently, much of my working day is at a computer, same as 95% of the population. A small portion of my day is spent behind a musical instrument thinking about things to do with it.
Right.
And the rest of the time is in travel. So I'm either traveling, or I'm either behind a computer, or I'm behind a drum set. It's one of the three options, really.
Right.
And that's not going to make very exciting television, you know.
Do you ever watch any of that kind of stuff and sort of shake your head at it?
No, I can't say I do.
Oh, okay. Now, you wrote quite a bit about the cutthroat business side of the 70s record business. I wanted to talk a little bit about payola, which was still in full swing in the early days of your career. Probably is still in full swing, really, quite frankly, but it was more out in the open back then. How did payola work, and how did it influence the careers of bands you've been in?
Well, that's a good question, and you know, I don't really want to recount the entire book to you down the phone. And suffice to say, if you read it, you'll get a lot more information on this. But I was a kid who was just kind of watching things from the outside. And the incident that came up in the book, and it's not payola, you know, it's just the way people take people out to dinner. The people, you know, they fix things. People deal. They always have done.
Right.
I grew up with a young Richard Branson who was forming Virgin Records. And our manager in Yes had a word with Richard Branson, and before you knew it, Yes's record was in the Virgin Records chart.
Right.
Now, that's to do with charts, and as you know, and I'm sure I know, but the reader of the book may not know, what is in a chart is entirely the prerogative of the guy who owns the chart.
Right.
So you make up charts, and if you put the Yes record at the top of a chart, or even in the Virgin chart, which in England in those days was very hip,
mm-hmm.
Next thing you know, you're going to be an item. You're going to be a real thing. So, you know, we got a leg up onto the ladder, same as nearly every band has always had a leg up onto the ladder.
Right.
I guess payola is more formalized now in a sense of plugging operations and arm twisting, you know, that...
it's what they call independent record promotion.
Independent record plugging, independent radio production. Yeah, absolutely. It's a sophisticated world of business, and there's very little that the outside guy can do to influence that, really, until you attract the attention of the big player.
Right. It's I mean, it really is a money game to get big success.
It's a money game.
The trading of money and favor here and there and everywhere.
I'm afraid it is. Yes. Yeah. And you know, like young policemen who realize after a year or two that they can't fix crime. Like young doctors who, after a year or two, realize they can't cure the world. Musicians, after a year or two, realize that this isn't only about how great your song is.
Right.
It has a lot to do with a huge amount of who's going to go into bat for you, who can bring your music to the attention of the market.
Right.
And for that, you need big influence and deep pockets.
Now, in several instances, you described Chris Squire as kind of slow-moving, perpetually late, and so on. How did the kind of interpersonal tensions in Yes, just lifestyle differences, financial differences, whatever, how does that play into the music? And is it healthy or unhealthy to have that kind of conflict in a group ultimately?
That's a very good question. I don't know. A lot of the British bands seemed to have that kind of tension. You know, I'm thinking of Daughtry Townsend, maybe even Jagger Richards. You know, there can often be a creative tension. The guys in the Kinks, remember them, Ray Davis and the brother.
They would punch each other out on stage. Sure.
Absolutely, and I remember because we supported them in Yes.
Oh, is that right?
And there was a lot of excitement in that kind of world, and somehow it seemed quite a British thing in a way. And Yes, the members of Yes came from extremely varied backgrounds, so we even had linguistic problems. I mean, I had a real problem understanding John Anderson physically from a northern part of England, that I didn't understand his accent, I couldn't understand what he was saying.
Oh, okay.
Regional accents are very strong in the UK. So, right there, you're having a physical difficulty in understanding what people are saying, let alone what they're thinking and how they're... So, yeah, there was definitely a creative tension. We brought all these things to the table, and you pushed and shoved, until your thing surfaced, until, your idea was accepted or something. And you get a result that way, but it can be bloody. And, many of the English rock groups of the sort of first 20 years that I was in the business were a lot like that. It wasn't particularly pretty. There was a certain amount of sulking, there was, horse trading. The guy with the biggest biceps and the thickest skin tended to win, and that's the way the song went. So it wasn't pretty. It wasn't pretty. We respected each other, certainly, but I can't say it was all beer and Skittles.
Right. Now, there's a chapter in your book entitled, What's It Like Working with Robert Fripp? I was somewhat surprised that there's not a chapter entitled, What's It Like Working with John Anderson?
Very good question. Nobody ever asked me that. But people consistently ask me, what's it like working with Robert Fripp? And the answer as to why that is the question is because Robert Fripp doesn't give interviews.
Oh, of course, right.
So if a guy doesn't give interviews, then I become the secondary guy. So I'm then asked, what's it like working with him?
I got you.
To which I can't say, go and ask him, because, he never gives an interview.
Oh, okay.
And it's a long answer, but Robert has been a magnificent musician. He's got a wonderful intellect, powerfully intelligent guy, perhaps more a thinker than a player. And in part of his thinking created, King Crimson, and one of the best platforms for a drummer to be in the latter part of the 20th century. Everybody would have killed to be in King Crimson as a drummer because you could dream up the weirdest stuff,
Right.
Great guy. I mean, he was difficult as hell, but hey, nobody said it would be easy.
He seems singularly unsuited to the public side of being a performing musician.
Doesn't he just?
Yes. It appears to make him almost visibly unhappy. Why do it then? Why not find something to do that would make him happier and then do it on the side or something?
Sterling, you'll have to ask Robert.
Fair enough. You mentioned several times through the course of the book that the real trick of a musical career is surviving the struggle of the early days and then surviving success. What's so difficult about success?
Well, all kinds of trouble starts with success. Well, the first problem with success is repetition. So whatever it was that made you successful, you're required to repeat it. That will make people money. So, you're paid a lot to be very repetitive. And you may want to do that, but be careful if you do that, because you may want to give up the will to live as well. It can be mind-numbingly boring. I remember doing a session with some guy who just done 125 cities with keyboards with Dire Straits.
Mm-hmm.
Now, keyboards in Dire Straits is not a great gig. It's not a keyboard band. You know what I mean?
Really not, yes.
It's not about keyboards, and it's going to be easy, and the fingers are going to move very slowly. And they're going to move in exactly the same place every night for 125 cities. And at the end of it, you're physically dead from the brain down, or brain up. Maybe you're dead everywhere. It's mind-numbingly repetitive. And so all those guys that are prancing around up there on a stage looking cool, that's an act.
Sure.
And if you're into acting, that's okay. But if you're a musician who doesn't really want to act, then you might want to think about something else. So, and if you leave a group that's successful, that can cause all kinds of problems. There's a variety of problems with success. But one of them won't be money, which is great. So, okay, you've got some money, and that's terrific. That can help no end.
Right. It can fuel a lot of your other ambitions. Huh?
Indeed it can. Indeed it can. But you need to go carefully and don't waste it all.
Right. Right. And musicians, do you agree that mostly musicians are not great money managers?
I would think that's fair to say, any more than, bankers are great musicians.
Right. You talked a little bit about television and how it can, what a cheap medium it is, and how the kind of music that you like and you perform doesn't generally come across well in television. That made me think back to the symphonic music of Yes and the performance of Roundabout that was on Regis and Kathy Lee.
Yeah, that was kind of a low spot, wasn't it?
It was. How does something come off that badly? How does it wind up coming off that badly?
Usually by somebody not saying no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it does seem like the wrong venue entirely.
Well, it's the wrong venue. I don't think I think we had a bass player. It was me and Steve Howe and a bass player that we'd met, that morning, kind of in the green room.
And no
said,
keyboard.
What key is it in? And we said, well, it's in this key. And can you play it? What we're going to do here is this. And in other words, it was not a wise move. And for me, I just took my eye off the ball. I should have said to Steve Howe, Steve, forget it. But it's very easy. Somebody says, there's 12 million people listening, could be nice. Mm-hmm. And of course it's not. It's always crap.
Yeah, you go in there and it does more harm than good,
Absolutely, can do a whole lot more harm than good. So you want to...
Seen the band would watch that and think, oh, no, I don't think I want to own a copy of that.
Absolutely so. So, you deal with mass media is a kind of double-edged sword. It can get you places, get you a long way if you're good. And you suit it, and what you do feeds the medium well, and it could also kill you if you persist in trying to fight it, because you'll never win.
Right. I actually interviewed Steve Howe the day after that, because I got an interview with him in support of that project, and he was very rueful the next day as far as, oh, you saw that? Oh, well.
Well, I blame him. He probably blames me.
That's funny. There's a somewhat of a Spinal Tap moment in the book where you're at Madison Square Garden on the Union tour, and it's your big moment, and your electronic drums simply fail. Mm-hmm. That's what transpires backstage after a thing like that. I mean, when you come.
Oh, me, I'm pretty easygoing. Once it's gone, it's gone. What to do. I mean, the guy who was looking after that equipment, Chris Ransom, otherwise known as Props, a wonderful guy. Mm-hmm. A lovely guy. He just took he just made a mistake. He had nothing to do, so he decided to, power down some computers, and they didn't come back up. That's what happens on the road.
Right. There's
the early days of taking drum computers around, and, trouble happens. I've forgotten all about it now, but only retrospectively did I realize that was probably the most humiliating moment of a career riddled with humiliating moments.
Oh, mercy. Speaking of humiliating moments, the Union album itself is
that's not great. Why don't we talk about something more, why don't we talk about something that was a success now?
Okay.
Now that we've talked about Regis and Kathy Lee and the Union album, let's talk about some blinding playing.
Okay. What would you point to for somebody who wasn't familiar with you as some of your better works, if somebody was going to dip their toe into the Bill Bruford body of work? Right.
Well, interesting. Very broadly, I've been around for 40 years. The first 20 years I was in rock groups called Yes, Genesis, and King Crimson. The second 20 years I was effectively a band leader and a jazz musician. So either, if you like old rock from way back in the 70s and 80s, go back to Yes, King Crimson, and Genesis. If you prefer more modern stuff, as I do, then you would probably want, I can recommend, in fact, the Summerfold Collection or the Winterfold Collection. Now, Summerfold and Winterfold are two small record companies that I run. And these two collections have tracks from across all the CDs I've made, the best tracks from across the best CDs.
Right.
So you would probably want to go there because you get, first of all, good value for money and then a big, broad range of music, and you can then go back into that particular CD from which the compilation was taken. So if you wanted to do that, you would go to BillBruford.com, you'd go to the shop, and you'd buy Summer Fall Collection or Winter Fall Collection.
Excellent, excellent. Now, you obviously have two different fan bases because of that are somewhat fractured. I mean, there's
Well, yeah, but you see, the overarching thing here is drumming.
Mm-hmm.
That you may in your world you may think of progressive rock and rock music and jazz, whereas I really think of drumming, and I care less about rock and jazz than you do. I certainly care very little about classic jazz, classic rock. What I care about is drumming, and how can I use my drum kit effectively. And when I was in rock, I wanted to use it effectively there, and then as rock became a tighter and less generous place, it became impossible to do anything on a drum set, so you moved to jazz, which is traditionally a much more generous place when it comes to imaginative playing.
You were talking about how rock has become so rigid well, particularly in the percussive part of it, because it is to click tracks and so much of it is triggered.
Yeah.
That hasn't gone over to jazz so much.
Hasn't gone over to jazz at all.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? Is it because of the difference in the marketing of it, that nobody can make a small fortune by electronically piecing records together?
Absolutely so. You know, jazz has a very small market. Now, of course, you might say, well, isn't that a pity? And I might say, yes, it's a pity, but on the other hand, it affords you freedom. And freedom means you can play what you want to the knowledgeable customer who tends to come to a jazz club. You're not in the world of mass entertainment any longer. And I like that. I'm just as happy playing jazz to 200 people as I am to playing rock to 20,000 people, and I've done both.
Right.
And they're different experiences, both great in their own way. But I would rather speak the way I speak, the way I want to speak in a jazz club, than have to slow things up and be repetitive and be a rock guy in a rock stadium.
Right.
So moving to jazz full time is an entirely voluntary kind of. Most guys try to go the other way. They want to go from jazz to be a successful rock star. You know, that's called selling out.
Oh, okay.
You know, but I seem to have made a career of going the other way, from a very successful rock guy down, if you like, to Birdland, you know, or to Yoshi's in San Francisco, or to Ronnie Scott's in London, you know,
right.
Where I would rather perform there.
Excellent, excellent. Now, you write that as you approach retirement, you're aware that there are some fans who are of the mind that you should continue on forever, and that you should want to continue on forever. And you sort of argue that, well, why wouldn't I want to eventually put down the drumsticks just as a policeman or a teacher would eventually retire? Because it's a gift. Is music, in fact, a gift from the perspective of the person who makes it? Or is it more of a career or a job?
Depends on the person, very much. And it's somewhere between a gift and a curse and a job.
Mm-hmm.
You know, on a scale, I suppose, it's a gift followed by a job followed by a curse.
Right.
Some people find making music very easy. It just pours out of them. They don't think about it. They just kind of ooze music. Other people find it harder, and I think I'm one of the guys that finds it harder to make music. I worry a lot about it. I practice really hard. I don't like much what I play. I always think the other guy has a much better angle on things, etc., etc. And if you are like me, and many more people are like me than you would think. Why? Because, of course, we're in the industry of human happiness. We're in a sales industry here, so people put a good spin on everything.
Right.
But there are more sick dogs out there than you would think.
I actually kind of, just because I interview people, I guess, I actually kind of think that the music business tends to, how can I put this, it seems to be geared toward the exploitation of damaged personalities. Certainly, you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, to wit Michael Jackson, you know.
Right.
I mean, a classic case of a guy who doesn't have the stamina, the strength of character to resist making his skin white. I mean, it's an unbelievable case. Now, most people don't define it as tough as that, but some people do, and I think my book has caused something of a stir because I really don't mind talking about this at all. I found towards the end of my career, I found it quite difficult.
Right.
Leading bands, working bands, being top, having to come up with good ideas in a highly competitive world of diminishing record sales, where more and more people have to do more, fewer people have to do more and more just to stay afloat, And I found that difficult, and I am interested in the tougher aspects of being a musician, about why we do it, about self-expectation, about the destructive nature of things, about burnout, if you like. All these things. I think that's good, juicy stuff, and my book deals with that at the end, and it's caused something of a stir because, people like me are not supposed to talk about that.
Right, it's supposed to be a thin promotional vehicle for
absolutely.
For yourself.
Absolutely, you're supposed to promote, and you're in sales. But now that I've retired, I can tell you exactly what I want to tell you,
right.
Which is great.
That's part of what I think is the strength of the book, is that it's not a thin promotional vehicle like, look at me, I'm Bill Bruford, I'm great, or whatever.
Yeah, you're not going to get that from me.
That's great. Now, I wanted to ask you, has retirement been what you thought or hoped it would be?
Well, I've been retired about 20 minutes. And all I know is I seem to work just as hard as before. Just to clear things up, Sterling, I have retired from public performance. In other words, I don't do concerts and I don't do drum clinics anymore.
Right.
However, I do a lot of interviews. I do a lot of writing. I do a lot of lectures. I have a lecture tour coming up in the UK in the fall. I make and produce records, and indeed I have new records out on September the 7th.
Oh, great.
A record of fresh material with a great British composer called Colin Riley. And that material was recorded just at the very end of last year, just before I stopped working full-time as a musician. So in a way, that's my last record, and I'm thrilled with that.
Very good.
And I release archive pieces. In other words, life is pretty busy.
Right, you're going to continue, obviously.
Yeah, I'm still in the music industry, kind of full-time, but it's just that I don't play concerts anymore.
I gotcha. Well, is there anything else that you want to discuss before we're done today?
No, Sterling, we've covered a lot, and I appreciate your interest in the subject. I've spent a lot of time in the music industry, and I'm just sort of pausing here to think how it is I can maybe give of my experience to the young. I think it's sometimes behoven upon musicians to teach, if possible, and I will probably find a position, I think, where I can probably talk along the lines of the way we've been talking to young musicians to try to avoid anybody getting seriously hurt.
Right. Which is, it's certainly. People go in with their eyes not wide open.
They do, as they do in many professions, but most professions, they try to explain a little to you beforehand.
That there's no college of rock or
there is.
that.
Well, there are plenty of fame schools which tell you how great it's going to be, but they don't tell you, how to get there. People can get disorientated trying to find the right way.
Right. Now, one last question. Have you been happy overall with the reaction to your book?
I've been hugely gratified. I mean, people have been absolutely sweet about it, and I'm slightly surprised. My publisher is slightly surprised, too. We're selling lots, and I'm absolutely thrilled. If I had another book in me, I'd start writing tomorrow, but I'm afraid there was only one story, and that's the story that's gone.
Well, excellent. Well, congratulations again on a really great piece of work.
Sterling, I appreciate it, and thank you for the interview.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
Okay.